Good evening and welcome. I'm Kelli Richards, CEO of the All Access Group and the host of All Access Radio. As a highly sought-after consultant, super connector, and trusted advisor, I spend my days connecting innovators and influencers from Silicon Valley with the content creators and storytellers in Hollywood. As a trusted advisor, I transform the quality of people's lives. And I'm also the author of the best-selling ebook, The Magic and Moxie of Apple, An Insider's View. Tonight's guest on the show is Beth Harrington. Beth is an independent producer, director, and writer whose fervor for American history, music, and culture has led to a series of award-winning and critically acclaimed films. Beth's most recent works, The Winding Stream, The Carters, The Cashes, and the Course of Country Music, and the Grammy-nominated Welcome to the Club, The Women of Rockabilly, reflect her long-standing love of music. A rock and roll singer and guitarist, she's most noted for her years as a member of Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers on Warner Brothers' Sire Records label. Beth currently lives in the Pacific Northwest, where she works with Oregon Public Broadcasting, producing, researching, and developing shows for national air, including the popular PBS series History Detectives. Welcome to the show, Beth.
Thanks, Kelli. Great to be here.
It's great to have you, and I just want to share for our listeners that we met last fall at the Portland Creative Conference, where both of us were privileged to be speakers.
Absolutely. It was great. What a great day that was.
Great day, great event.
Yeah.
So for starters, Beth, having a trusted advisor is so important. I'm sure you'll agree, and I wonder, before you got to be where you are, who some of your mentors were or have been along your journey.
I'm so old that the whole concept of mentoring was kind of not on the table when I started, but I do look back and think that there were women in particular who really went out of their way to help me.
Mm-hmm.
My first boss out of college in a public relations job that I had, a government public relations job, was a woman named Jean Bancroft. She was someone who came up through the ranks of the Girl Scouts of America. She was an administrator in Girl Scouts and had done PR for Girl Scouts. And she ended up having a great feminist ethic that I look back on now and realize that. But when I was in my 20s, I don't think I fully appreciated just where she had come from and what it meant for her to be there and how she nurtured me. But she was one of the first people to tell me that I was a good writer and that I was good at storytelling and all the things that, of course, led me to be a filmmaker. She nurtured and encouraged in a way that I can see clearly now at this point in my life, and I didn't really fully appreciate it at the time. I knew she was being nice to me, but I didn't get what the nice part was.
This reminds me, if I might interject, of when Mr. Rogers accepted his Lifetime Achievement Award for, I think it was an Emmy Award. Yep. And you probably saw this or heard about it, but he went up to do his acceptance speech with his 1 minute, and he used his 1 minute to ask the audience to close their eyes and think of the teacher or mentor or someone of influence that had such an impact, it shifted the trajectory of the rest of their lives.
Right.
And there wasn't a dry eye in the house.
Oh, my God, yeah.
It's so moving that and his generosity of using his minute to do that for other people, it's just so him. But it kind of reminds me of, what you're saying about that particular individual.
Yeah, and, it's funny you mention him because I got a chance to meet him and work with him one day in Pittsburgh.
Really?
On a PBS show, yeah. It was the first show that was going to be in high definition for public television, and he was in it. And before we got to meet him, what was amazing was that he, I didn't grow up with him. My siblings grew up with him, but I was kind of too cool for school already. I was a teenager.
Yeah, he wasn't hip and cool for those of us at that era.
Yeah, I was like, well, whatever, And so when we went to Pittsburgh, I was shocked that the crew that we were going to be working with was super excited to be working with them. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And then we got to this beautiful conservatory garden where we filmed them. And he was working with our host, who was a Silicon Valley person himself, and really well, kind of edgy and not a Mr. Rogers type, and let's say, and not only did he have our host just putty in his hands, but the rest of the crew was like putty in his hands. And by the end of the day, he had come up to me, sought me out, asked me about myself, asked me about the things that I was interested in.
Yep.
I told him what those were, and then he looked at me and he said, "Don't stop doing those things. Those are very important things to be doing, Beth." And I just about projectile cried, like I melted. And when I got home, I started sobbing because I felt like I had been in the presence of like some very holy person. And
well, I think you were. He had an unusual gift and by the way, it was also, I believe, a pastor. He had an unusual gift for making every individual feel incredibly special. That was the gist of the entire program he did.
And he lived it, and I was so shocked to see how genuine that was.
Oh, yeah, and that's what the power of why the tenure that he enjoyed in that role was, because it was full authenticity. He couldn't have been more generous in his spirit, and I don't think there was a difference between who he was as the host of that show and who he was in real life. So I don't know how we got onto that detour, but I mean, I started it, but it's an important one because it's an example of how I don't think some people's legacies are respected until they're gone.
I know.
And we're going to get to that in a minute with Winding Stream, but there is a theme here. There's a thread I can see that ties this together. But in fact, I think I'm going to segue into that because that's a good segue, and then we'll come back to the question I was going to ask you prior. This most recent film that you did, which I loved, The Winding Stream, Carter's Caches in the Course of Country Music, tells the story of the original Carter family and the mark that they made on the history of American music, which I really don't think a lot of people even ever heard of, nor people even in the music industry like myself knew about the depth and the impact of what they did. And I'm curious if you can share with our listeners what led you to make this film. Why did it call to you so strongly where you ultimately prevailed and got it out there?
Well, for the very reason you stated, because I was aware that there was that legacy, but I didn't understand the full depth of it myself. But I kept, as a younger person following rock and roll, which was what I came up in and what I love to this day, I was very involved in looking at the antecedents of the music I loved. Like that was part of the fun of music for me, was knowing the history and knowing where the stuff came from. So, there's no Beatles without, Chuck Berry and Carl Perkins, and there's no Dylan without Woody Guthrie. There's no, so I was interested in that kind of thing. And I had made a previous film, Welcome to the Club, about women rockabilly singers, and was very interested in the early rockabilly people anyway, and Johnny Cash, of course, was one of those people. And I remembered even watching Johnny Cash's show, largely to see Dylan and people like that, I know he kept talking about the Carters, and he kept bringing out his sisters-in-law and this little old lady who played guitar, who was his mother-in-law. And I kept thinking, what's the deal with her? And over the years, I started connecting the dots. There was music that came out that I followed, like the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band did the Circle Be Unbroken album. And I started to realize that there were connections there to music I cared about, too. It wasn't my birthright. I didn't grow up in the South. I grew up in Massachusetts, but I got it, and I thought, it was a sort of an interesting thing to me in the back of my mind. And so when I had finished Welcome to the Club, I thought, now's the time to keep going back further, push back further into country music and find those connections with the Carters. And so I started to delve into that because I didn't think people fully appreciated their story and the way that they kind of launched the thousand ships that became what we call country music, but also sort of folk and Americana music today and all the variations in that theme.
Right, so including the roots music stuff that was so popular a decade ago.
Absolutely, yeah. All of that stuff, there's a line to the Carters and all of it. And that's not accidental because the Carters were big, sort of scavenger hunters, if you will, of some of this music. And they, they mined American music themselves to find the best stuff and sort of either re-record or recraft some of those pieces into Carter family music.
Well, and even goofy stuff in the 60s. We talk about the Johnny Cash series that he had for a while. But around that same time was that TV series Hee Haw.
Absolutely.
It was just the goofiest thing ever. But the musical guests they had and stuff, I mean, it all ties to that,
Yeah.
Again, you make fun of Hee Haw and Mr. Rogers, but there were some real touchstones in those things that make them timeless.
Absolutely. And, that's another piece, not to get too crazy and political here, but, it's also, there's a lot of stuff culturally that we stand at an arm's length on and say, oh, isn't that silly, or isn't that this, or isn't that, and it's meaningful to somebody, and it's meaningful to large bunches of people for a reason. And even though I didn't grow up with the Carter music, it isn't something I understood from like an early age. You don't have to listen to it long to appreciate it, and then it's an entree into a whole new world. And that's the thing I love about music in general and cultural, these cultural passageways into other people's worlds. Is like this is important to some people, and it turns out as I traveled with the film, it was important to a lot of people.
It turns out that these things that some people dismiss or make fun of actually stand the test of time.
Absolutely.
Because they really did touch the heart of so many generations. Right. I'm curious, Beth, what your favorite part of making the film was.
I mean, there's a real obvious one, which is meeting Johnny Cash. That was
I get that. I would
cool.
have thought that it was probably capturing so many interviews before these people passed on.
Well, that's for sure. And we got his interview just 3 weeks before he died. So I was very grateful for that. And he was wonderful to us. But I also have to say that meeting Jeanette Carter, who is the sort of the keeper of the flame, if you will, of the family. I mean, she's the last living witness to a lot of this history, or was when we interviewed her. She's gone now, too. But Jeanette not only was AP and Sarah Carter's daughter, she performed with them on the radio in the 1930s. She also grew up to be a mother and of other children who carried on the music, and she ran the family music venue called the Carter Family Fold. She conceived of it and ran it as a tribute to her family. And she was tough as nails and really cool, but kind of a soft-spoken woman in a lot of ways. And she was just a fascinating person, and I was so grateful to meet her because I felt like I met the last of a certain breed of people who cared about this stuff. And
well, I agree with you. And when I was watching the film, I noticed about her that, talk about the wind beneath your wings. This was someone that really was not in the limelight.
No.
But she herself played her role in that family and in the mix of their success in her way, even if nobody ever heard of her or knew who she was until you put the spotlight on her in the film.
Yeah, I mean, obviously her cousin June Carter and her other cousins, June's sisters, became better known because they toured with, and in June's case, married Johnny Cash.
Correct.
Jeanette was very much in the background in a lot of ways by choice in some ways and just by circumstance. But she, in many ways, you could argue, did more to maintain the legacy than anybody. So
and that's what was so powerful about doing a film like this is the people that were even could have been considered so-called peripheral. I don't mean that as an insult, but that you otherwise would never have known about.
Right.
Have a piece of legacy showcased in a well-done documentary like what you did.
Thank you.
Otherwise, nobody would have ever heard of them, and their legacy would be lost.
Well, that's the joy of this to me in a lot of ways. As you can imagine, making documentaries, nobody's getting rich doing this. So that's not my goal. But
you have to argue Burns is doing okay.
Yeah. But a big goal is trying to, honor people. A big thing in this film for me was that the man Leslie Riddle, who is a contributor to the Carter family music, and that he helped A.P. Carter collect some of these songs and rearrange them and fashion them into new recordings. He's an African-American man who most people have never heard about. Mm-hmm. And in the making of the film, we got to highlight his contribution. And then kind of after the fact, people in North Carolina, where he was born, honored him with a monument in the town he was born in part because they caught wind of the research we'd done.
Ah, see, there's some
and that
power.
Was really satisfying.
Yeah, I'll say.
Yeah.
That is, I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's a deep tendril that is really part of what must be so meaningful about doing this work, independent of whether it ever makes a lot of money or it doesn't.
Yes.
Yes. And there have to be other reasons that people do documentaries besides one.
There are, yeah.
Now, that segue to shifting gears to your prior film, I'm curious on Women of Rockabilly.
Right.
Welcome to the club. Who was your favorite woman of Rockabilly, and what did you love most about her?
It's hard to say because they all were fantastic women and had their, each one had something really great and unique and wonderful about her. But I kind of like Janice Martin because she was just so feisty and so rebellious all the way through her life. She was really a kind of kick-ass girl, even as a teenager.
Yep.
But the person I became closest to, and is just a fantastic human being, is Wanda Jackson. And I was, and I still am friendly with Wanda and get to see her periodically, and she's still touring. And even though, Wanda and I come from very different worlds, we've really forged a pretty interesting friendship. And I just think she's a real woman of parts. She's got a lot going on. She's on some level she seems an unlikely candidate to be a rockabilly girl because she's extremely religious, and many years she went off and did sort of missionary work in Alaska, and so she's got this like really intricate background. But then her fans kind of called her out of retirement, and she came back full force and became a rockabilly star again, and then ended up in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame too, which was really a great thing. After the film came out,
again, digging for nuggets, and I think the reality is, I'm sure you'll agree with me, Beth, because you're a real observer of humanity. I think you could argue that more people than we would realize that you never hear about have this rich, multidimensional thread of their lives, their personalities, that, gosh, if in a world, in a time where everybody's able to tell their story in social media, this kind of thing can really come forth. Right now it's kind of goofy at social media. It's really top-level surface stuff. But if you use the medium properly, we can really get new layers of complexity about people.
Yeah,
if we know how to do storytelling properly and use the media.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of what I'm after. I mean it's I think there's this misconception that to tell a story well, it has to be stripped down to really bare components. And there's a little bit of truth to that. I mean, you want some through line. You want something streamlined in terms of your story arc. But, the nuance and the complexity is what makes life interesting and should make these stories interesting. And
a good editor can knock down a lot of the chaff from the wheat. But I mean, that's the goal of a good editor. But I agree with you. I think I'm having trouble articulating it, but I do believe that people are geared to be storytellers more than they give themselves credit for, and the other half of that is that people are interesting if somebody's willing to turn a camera on and let them tell their story or pull their story out of them.
Yep.
And that's what you get to do for a living, and it's very exciting.
Yeah.
And I understand that you had a personal miracle, Beth, which resulted in the film The Blinking Madonna and Other Miracles.
Yes,
would you be willing to tell our listeners a little bit about the story behind that film?
Yeah. So in 1991, I lived in the Italian neighborhood in Boston. In fact, I lived there for many years. I lived there almost 20 years. It's called the North End of Boston. And I'd been making documentaries about the religious rituals that go on in the neighborhood, the kinds of things you see in The Godfather, for example, you know, the people carrying the statue of a saint. And in my neighborhood, there were many of those. And one of the major feasts, they call them, was the Feast of the Madonna del Soccorso, Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And I had filmed this and made a couple of films that were sort of ethnic studies films. But then one day, as a favor to my friends in the organization that ran this feast, I videotaped something with just a kind of camcorder I had and gave them the tape. I went to this procession and handed them the tape afterwards. I didn't even look at it. And they called me afterwards in a panic. One of the guys said, "You got to come down to the club. You got to see this videotape that you made for us. There's a miracle on it." And I said, what's the miracle? And they said, the Madonna blinks her eyes on the videotape. You got to come down here and look at the tape. So I went down to the club, and sure enough, that's what it looks like. It looks like the statue, a painted statue, plaster of Paris statue of the Virgin Mary is blinking her eyes on the videotape. So this, of course, caused a great deal of stir in the club among the men that I knew. And but they asked me what it was, and I said, I think it's the autofocus on my camera. And I explained how it was done, and, it's completely accidental, but I explained it. But the neighborhood being what it is and people's belief being what it is, people started to take it. The guys I know said, okay, if that's what you tell us, we believe you, we trust you, that's the way it goes. But the neighborhood,
but the word was out.
Information catches fire very quickly.
Yeah.
And so within a few days, it was on the front page of the Boston Herald. It was on all the news stations at 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock. It, just went crazy. It went viral before there was a way for things to go viral.
Right.
It was a big news story. And I found myself in the middle of it. I was a sort of recovering Catholic in the middle of what was supposed to be a miracle, and I was a media person in the middle of a huge media event, and it was all kind of wacky. And, I would have left it at that, except that all of a sudden my life, which had been kind of not great that year, I'd had a lot of personal problems that year, all of a sudden turned around. And all kinds of good things happened. A handsome Frenchman moved in downstairs from me. I got a job back that I had lost in a layoff. I got to travel overseas. All this stuff started happening. And I thought, what is a miracle anyway? So the nature of the miracle is very loosely defined. But for me, it meant not only that good things can happen when you least expect them, but also that my community that I felt didn't necessarily see me for who I was, completely knew who I was and completely honored that. And they started to demonstrate it in all these different ways after this thing became a story. And
in addition to all of those good things, the press that resulted would surely have given a boost to the film.
Well, it did over time. That's true. Yeah. In the coming years, it did for sure. But for the first few months, I didn't think there was. I wasn't even thinking about a film. That the thing had happened, and then a friend of mine, a filmmaker now, Deborah Granick, who's pretty well known. Deborah convinced me that maybe there's a film in this, and I said, I don't know what the film is. It's a little story that's a human interest story for the news. And she said, no, I think it's bigger than that. I think it's a story about you. And then, of course, once she pointed that out, I had to struggle with the idea of, do I want to be in a film that I'm making myself?
Exactly.
And that became a very big deal. And I did, obviously do it. And it was an incredible learning experience for me in terms of what it feels like to be in front of the camera, how you tell your own story without being completely self-serving and obnoxious.
And that's back to the point I was making about people having the means to be able to be storytellers these days and putting themselves in front of the camera. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, much more common now. When I made that film, it wasn't as accepted, so it was a little.
No.
It was kind of a leap, and I think people were looking at it askance at first, but now I think it's a much more understandable mode of storytelling is to put yourself in it. So.
And one of my mentors was actually Steve Jobs at Apple, and during my time, before, during, and after my time at Apple, and one of his favorite quotes is, "You can only connect the dots looking backwards." And so I pose to you the next question, which is, would you say looking backwards, would you say there's a common thread that you try to weave into all the films you make, or does each one stand on its own as distinct and unique?
No, there's always a connection. Some of them are real obvious to me, and some of them aren't. I do have a fascination with religion and spirituality, even though I claim publicly not to be that much of either. It's always there. It's all. I went to Catholic school for 12 years, and of course it's in the
part of the fabric of who you are.
Yeah. But I make films that I often scratch my head and think, well, this film technically has nothing to do with religion. How'd you manage to get that in there? I did a film about the Aleutian Islands, and there's this whole thing about Russian Orthodoxy in it. Or I make these.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And the other pieces, I'm very interested in diversity of story, and I really try to look at a story and say, is this all it's about? Is it just about these, 3 white people from Virginia? Well, it turns out it's not about these 3 white people from Virginia. It's about all these other influences in their music, including Mr. Leslie Riddle, this African-American song collector, these folks from the Mexican border, from, Tin Pan Alley in New York. And so I start to, I always try to expand the story so people's stories aren't living in a vacuum, that they really...
Well, yeah, and then what you're doing is actually creating a tapestry that threads all of those different through lines together and makes sense out of them and makes it more readily digestible to the viewer as to why all this matters.
Yeah, that's the goal. I really try to do that, so that's my hope anyway.
And from a spiritual perspective, I believe... Listen, the Beatles weren't even 30 years old when they broke up. So that means they were in their 20s throughout all of the creative output they created.
That's right.
And a lot of it was very sophisticated beyond their years, like Yesterday and, In My Life and those kind of songs. So I believe that gifted people co-create from a spiritual standpoint with other realms or they're channeling. Certain creativity. Does that sound wacky, or does that resonate with you and how you work?
No, I think there's something there. I mean, with any creative pursuit, I think there's a place where you kind of map out a path, and then you've got to let go and trust that other forces are going to help get you to the finish line creatively. I mean, there's a lot of steps you have to take concretely that are the nuts and bolts of it to make something. But
if you trust and allow for something greater than yourself to come through you, the outcome could wind up being much better than you ever could have imagined creating on your own.
Absolutely, and with Blinking Madonna, that was certainly a case of that, where I thought, okay, I know what the heart of this is, and I know the feeling I have about it, and I know the feeling I have about this community, and I'm going to do my damnedest to do the hard work to make it happen, but there's a piece of this that's completely out of my hands. And I did feel that all the way through that project, like this is kind of out of my hands, and some nights I'd go to bed thinking this is the worst thing I've ever done, and then there were some nights I'd think this is the best thing I've ever done. And it turned out in more ways than one to be the latter, that, from a standpoint of satisfaction and resonance with people, and, it was really a highlight for me creatively, and a lot of it was out of my hands.
And then you even wonder at times, how did that happen? That one missing puzzle piece, and you realize that was serendipity at work, right?
Yep.
So I believe that very strongly.
Yeah.
How do you feel, Beth? Sorry, I meant to say, how do you find a balance between objective journalistic integrity on the one hand and passion for your subject on the other? Has there ever been a time when it was difficult for you to find that balance?
The journalistic part of this matters such a great deal to me. I'm kind of, I think some of the people around me sometimes think I'm being fanatical about it. But, more than ever, I feel like we need to revisit those principles all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very difficult, I'll give you an example. When I was making the Winding Stream, it was very difficult to raise the money for that for reasons that still, kind of, I can see what they were now, but I realized that some of it was timing and some of it was a certain disintegration of business models that used to pertain that don't pertain anymore and that kind of thing. But needless to say, it took a while to raise the money, and there were many people around me who didn't understand, who didn't come from a journalistic background, who were saying, "Why can't the Carter and Cash families give you money to make your film? They have money." And I kept saying, no, I can't. I couldn't do that. And in fact, very kindly, some of the members of the family did come forward and say, "Do you want us to contribute?" And I had to turn them down. I said, I really appreciate what you just offered. I said, but from a journalistic standpoint, that's a conflict of interest.
Mm-hmm.
They're my subjects. I couldn't accept money from my subjects. And a lot of people around me who didn't understand the ethics of journalism thought I was insane. We got through the film. We found proper ways to raise the money to make the film, and it all worked out. But there were definitely people around me who did not understand, and I just couldn't. It's not that it's such a hard-hitting piece of journalism, obviously, but the fact remains that there needs to be that kind of distance from a subject in some ways. I mean, I obviously nurture good relationships with the people I film.
Sure.
But there's a place where you have to build a slight
and you also
line,
wanted, Yeah, exactly right. And you also wanted full, license to have editorial control. You wouldn't have wanted to get into any issues there.
Have editorial control, exactly.
Yeah,
so it's a concept that's getting a little lost, I have to say. And sometimes when I teach about this stuff, I get a lot of blank expressions from students who go,
so that's a good segue to go into that, because that was my next point, was to talk about your role teaching courses in film and media at universities in the Pacific Northwest, including Washington State, Lewis and Clark. What would you say is the most important takeaway that you try to impress on your students?
Well, I mean, I really want them to think critically.
Mm-hmm.
I want them to use these opportunities, especially in documentary filmmaking, to think critically. What are they saying? What are their sources of information? I mean, again, it's so easy to get online now and find something that will reinforce some belief that you have.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know whether it's actually true or not? I mean, obviously this is a hot topic right now.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's something that's been of concern to me for a long time, because a lot of the students I've had, have grown up in a world where there's access to some kind of information all the time at their fingertips. Not to completely sound like an old cranky person who wants the kids off my front lawn, but, I used to have to go to a library to look things up in a book, and I would have to know something about the book and where the source of information.
Hey, you and me both. We come from the same generation, and God forbid we had to go through microfiche.
Oh, right.
Which exist anymore. Hard catalogs.
Yeah.
What are those?
A Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature.
How about encyclopedias? I mean, really. I mean, we had to do it the hard way. You had to be proud to be resourceful.
Yeah. And that tactile experience led you to recognize, I got this piece of information from this source, and I got this. And you still had to vet that source. It isn't like all books were perfect, but at least you kind of knew where some of this information was coming from.
Exactly.
The first time I worked with someone who said, I'll just look it up on Wikipedia, I went, yeah, but stop for a minute.
So the title of that chapter is Know Your Source, Vet Your Source.
Exactly.
And it's never been more important. You know, Beth, I can't let you go without talking about your time with Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers. Can you tell us a short story about what it was like to play with them and your experience?
Well, Jonathan is an amazing individual. He's one of those. He's one of those iconic people, you know, not super well known in some circles, but the circles who know him, of course, know and love him. I often say that the reaction to Jonathan is when people ask me, "Oh, you used to be in a band?" And if I say the Modern Lovers, the reaction is binary. Either people go, "Oh my God," or they flatline. There's nothing in between.
Yeah.
And
favorite.
and Jonathan is just he's an iconoclastic, interesting, autodidact. He's taught himself foreign languages. He reads voraciously. He's got he's a stonemason as a hobby / sideline. He's a fascinating person, and we're still really good friends. In fact, I spent some time with him this summer and in April this year when I was touring with Winding Stream. He even got up and sang a Carter family song at one of the screenings.
Fabulous.
Yeah. So it was that was an incredibly validating experience to be in that band because he handpicked me. He was looking for a backup singer. I was a friend of a friend. He said, "Yeah, her." And he gave me a chance that nobody else would have given me because I wasn't even trying that hard to be a singer. It was kind of a fluke. But he liked
it's like Forrest Gump.
It's
part of your story.
Yeah, he liked me. He liked my sound, and we had a great relationship. And he's still very important to me. And I don't think I would be making music documentaries necessarily if I hadn't gotten that kind of validation from him and been part of the music world the way I was with that band.
No, that's terrific. Yeah. It's a great chapter of your life. So before we finish our chat, Beth, I like to ask you the most important question that I ask all my guests, and that is, what comes next for you? What's the one project or collaboration that you've not yet started that you dream about creating as part of your legacy?
Well, I've got a few things cooking, but the one that is more of a departure is that I'm working on a music-based narrative web series that's partly that's very much inspired by the Winding Stream. It's fictional. It stars a musician I'm very excited about who's a kind of a rising star by the name of Petunia. And that's a guy, Petunia.
Oh gosh.
And he's very much he's an incredible Americana artist in the style of a Jimmy Rogers, early 20s kind of singer. And so I'm kind of building something that's got a kind of supernatural bent to it, where this guy is a sort of immortal musician living in the past and in the present. And it's been really fun developing it. We're going to start shooting in another couple of months, and I'm really excited about it. I'm hoping we can get a nice package together and get this thing fully fleshed out.
Well, that sounds exciting, and judging by the caliber of the work you've already done in the portfolio so far, I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of it.
Thanks. Yeah, it'll be fun.
Where can our listeners go to learn more and connect with you, Beth?
Well, there are two places. One is BethHarrington.com, and the other place is thewindingstream.com. And there are both ways to write to me there, and I'd love to hear from people.
And learn more about your work, of course.
Yeah.
And everybody should watch The Winding Stream. It's really a powerful documentary.
Oh, thanks.
Loved it.
A labor of love.
Beth, I wish you continued success, and again, I want to thank you for making time out of your precious time out of your day to join us on this interview.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly. It's great talking to you.
I look forward to our being in touch again soon.
Me too.
And thanks again to our listeners, as always, for joining us here on the All Access Radio. We'll look forward to hearing you again next week. Good night, everybody.